Will you pray with me? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I'm going to start this sermon with a confession. I had a really hard time writing it. I actually threw out 2 nearly completed versions. And I'm not really sure why, because I love this story. It's kind of the metaphor for everything I believe to be true about God. The abundance, the generosity, the compassion. It's not a hard text to preach on ordinarily. But each time I sat down to write, I could not find a way into the story. Maybe I've heard it too many times. Maybe you've heard it too many times. Maybe I'm stuck on how to talk about miracles in the 21st century. I don't know. Maybe. So in my stuckness, I decided to walk the labyrinth. I was too much in my own head at this point, and I just needed to put one foot in front of the other and move a bit. The labyrinth is often the place where I can let my mind and my heart loosen up, let God in to all that static. And so I took a deep breath and a first step, and then a second step, and then a third step, and I just couldn't stay in the moment. I couldn't clear my mind and just let the walk happen. My deep breathing got shallow again, and despite how I was moving around this circle, I was still stuck. You might have had some of these experiences where your anxious little mind keeps running in circles. I kept picturing that blank screen that I left up on my computer with that cursor blinking impotently at me. And with each little step, that knot in my stomach just kept creeping back, and that little voice in my head kept saying, "You got nothing, you got nothing, you got nothing." And that's when I realized my problem. I've been listening to a voice that's been telling me, "You got nothing." Do you ever hear that one? It's really hard to override. It's the one that pops up in your day and points out everything you don't have. One day you might hear it telling you that you don't have enough money in your checkbook, or room in your house, or experience on your resume. Or it may go for the big score and tell you that you don't have enough security or worth or relationships or love. And it silences anything else that might be trying to point out to us the good things in our lives. We human beings seem hardwired to focus on what we don't have. And believe me, it's a recipe for getting stuck. And I know that because my difficulty in writing this sermon is really just a symptom of a deeper sense of scarcity that I'm struggling with in my life right now. Some of it's real and literal. Like most of you here, every once in a while I worry if there's enough in my checkbook to cover the bills this month. Some of it is emotional and spiritual. I wonder whether I've really got what it takes to be who I feel God is calling me to be. But either way, it's in there, and it can be paralyzing. I think a lot of us wrestle with believing we have enough, believing we are enough. Our consumer culture thrives on telling us that we are not successful enough, or happy enough, or good-looking enough, or lovable enough, so that they can sell us that very thing to fill the void. But of course it doesn't. And then we feel emptier than when we started. And so we fall for the pitch again. And money becomes more important than relationships, beauty more desirable than health, success more valuable than integrity. What we consume becomes more important than who we are. And if that's our metric, we will never have enough. A lens of scarcity can distort our vision of ourselves. Like a funhouse mirror, it can make the lack look huge while minimizing all the grace and blessings that surround us. And if all we see as real in our lives is what we don't have, the emptiness just gets overwhelming. And that is where I could finally enter into this story. For sitting on that hillside in Galilee on that summer evening were people who struggled with deep emptiness too. Matthew tells us that the crowd had followed Jesus on foot from the towns, and by the time he returned to them on the shore, there were thousands of them. Thousands of them. What were they looking for? What did they need? Probably many of the same things that we do. Some were broken in body or spirit. Some carried anxieties and stress. Some were without food or a place to sleep. But despite their numbers, they were not statistics of need to Jesus. Each person, each pain, each hunger mattered to him. And so he reached deep into his well of compassion and he healed them. Matthew uses that word compassion very intentionally, for it's more than kindness. It's more than pity or charity. Compassion means to feel with. And Jesus felt with those people. He knew what they were going through. He could relate to their emptiness because at times he felt it too. And he knew that they needed to see their lives not through that lens of their own scarcity, but through the lens of God's abundance. So when it was dinner time and their physical emptiness of their bellies became real, Jesus didn't send the people away to fend for themselves. He gathered what little scraps people had and he multiplied it. He multiplied it until it became a feast of such abundance that there were 12 baskets of leftovers, more than what they had even started with. Now, this story, of course, is a miracle story. One of the most famous in the Gospels and one of the few that exists in all 4 Gospels. And that tells me that it was central for how the earliest church saw Jesus. He was not just a healer to them, not just a miracle worker. He is someone who shows them who God is. And that's really what miracles are about. They're not fancy magic tricks to impress us or to convince us that Jesus is God. That is way too easy and way too superficial. No, the purpose of miracles are to be signs to show us who God is, what God's character is about. They are metaphors that take us beyond what we see on the surface to a greater and deeper reality. Metaphors are the way that we human beings, with our limited little language skills, describe truths that are just too big for facts alone. And the truth of this miracle is that God can transform our fears of scarcity into extravagant generosity and radical trust. When Jesus gathers those 5 loaves and 2 fish, he doesn't divide them into 5,000 tiny pieces so that each person just gets a nibble. He gathers them, he lifts them up to God in gratitude, and he entrusts them to God's love, to God's power. And then he just shares them, confident that there will be enough. Now, at first, the disciples are skeptical, and that's understandable. For they are caught in the same scarcity model that the rest of us are, convinced that there's never enough to go around, anxious that they won't have what they need. But Jesus knows God well enough to see the world through that lens of abundance. As the human face of God, he sees through God's eyes. And what's more, he invites us to participate in that vision. For there is more than one miracle in this story. There are several, and we have a role to play. I once heard the definition of a miracle as not when God does the will of the people, but when the people do the will of God. That's a miracle. Like 12 people reaching into their pockets to share what little they had, even when it seemed impossible to feed 5,000. Like gratitude being able to overcome anxiety. I believe the true miracle here is not just the multiplication of the food, but the fact that Jesus entrusts his disciples to be the agent of this radical generosity, that he invites them to override their skepticism and doubt that they could possibly have enough, and that they do it. Matthew is clear that Jesus didn't feed all these people by himself. He needed his disciples to help him. It becomes their role to take God's abundance to the people, to show them God's compassion, to feel with them, and to feed them. The miracle is not when God does the will of the people, but when the people do the will of God. And that miracle continues in our lives too. In the midst of all of our anxieties and doubts and insecurities, we are handed a different kind of lens, a chance to see the world through God's eyes. And in just a few moments, we will gather around this table where God's love is laid out for us extravagantly. Just as Jesus embodies God's abundance for the people on that hillside, just as he empowered his disciples to be the miracle of God's generosity for others, he invites us to share in this meal so that we can see our lives through that same lens. To see our emptiness as a sign that we are hungry for the things that matter. To see that regardless of what's in the bank account or on our resume or in our cupboards, that we will always have enough that makes us beloved in God's eyes. This meal is our commissioning to let that miracle continue. And so as we receive this feast of abundant love this morning, may it be multiplied 1,000-fold through our lives so that we might share it extravagantly with all who hunger, including ourselves. Who says we've got nothing? May it be so. Amen.